very much welcome again. Today we have the pleasure of introducing to you Professor Mohamed Salih, who is a professor of the politics of developing countries at Leiden University and also a professor here at the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague. Very much welcome.
Thank you.
Professor Salih, let me start out asking you a question. We have dealt in this course with a couple of regional organizations and their role in terms of the maintenance of peace and stability.
Yeah.
I would be very interested, how do you see currently the activities of the African Union in terms of contributing to peace and stability on the African continent?
The African Union plays a very important role in peace and security in the continent, despite many skeptics about whether this role is significant or not. This, at least I can mention two reasons. The shift in 2002 from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union signaled a major shift in the orientation of Africa towards security. First of all, that the old idea about the sanctity of sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries has ended, meaning that allowing the African Union in its new form, number one, to interfere in conflicts where human rights and genocide or crimes against humanity are committed, but also allowing African countries to request the African Union, particularly it is a Security Council, the African Security Council, to intervene in such countries. This is a major shift in terms of how Africans look at security, because in the past, look at the conflict in the Sudan. It continued from 1555 up to 1971, 72, and then it started again since 1983 and ended in 2005, a long period of time where the African Union could not intervene. The same thing with the conflict in Ethiopia, conflict in Angola, the conflict in Mozambique. All of these conflicts because the African Union thought of the sanctity of the borders that the African inherited from the colonial rule, they were not able to interfere. Today, they can do that, and they have done a number of interventions, whether through ECOWAS forces in Liberia and Sierra Leone, whether the joint force with the United Nations in Darfur in the Sudan, in Burundi, in Somalia, in many other countries where you see the African Union is increasingly involved. And the second thing is that the new thinking in Africa about African solutions for African problems. A shift also away from the fact that Africa was very much dependent on foreign forces, particularly Europeans. It depends on the country where it has a conflict. If the conflict was colonized by France, then of course the Anglophone countries under the French military intervention will try to solve the problems. If it was the British, also it is the Anglophone countries that will interfere. So I think it plays a very, very major role.
Is it actually, in institutional terms, it seems that the African Union Security Council appears to be modeled a bit on the basis of the example of the UN Security Council. Is that a coincidence, or has that maybe been a deliberate attempt to account for a fair regional representation within the organization? Could such criteria have mattered?
Yeah. I think it is not a coincidence. First, the African Union, what do you call it, it's the architecture of peace and security, consists of the Security Council, that is the African Security Council, and then it is supported by three institutions. One institution is standby force, the second institution is the early warning system, and the third one is the military committee, or the committee of the militaries. They also have two support organizations of these three different institutions, and that is the African Peace Fund and the African Committee of the Wise. So the whole structure itself is inspired by the United Nations Security Council. You are right in that, but also it derives its authority from the Security Council. It operates within the United Nations instruments, because if the Africans establish their completely separate Security Council that is not operating under the international architecture for peace and security that is already there, they might be also isolated from their own obligations to the international community. So, of course, you are very much right. But I think the main difference here, and that is something I can consider it African, the committee of the wise men and women. And this committee of the wise, they are always the ones who start the very early visits to the countries where they have a problem or have a conflict, to start talking with the adversaries, the government, the opposition forces, and those who are involved, and try to reach a solution before they go and those issues are discussed at the level of the African Security Council. So there is some small African element added to it, that is to see how can African also use some of their own tradition and try to solve some of those international problems within their continent.
Actually, a very amazing way of trying to tackle the issues. It's wonderful to see that.
Yeah.
And actually, if we talk in a general sense in terms of African security and African security needs, I believe I have seen in your own academic work an emphasis that maybe the military security aspect has tended to be a bit overemphasized, and that there will be other aspects that are extremely relevant to African security, including human dignity, and trying to establish the frameworks for which such concepts really can be realized on the ground. What is your opinion on that?
I think my opinion is informed by my concern about the fact that because of the conflicts that the African continent witnessed during the 90s and the early or the first decade of the 21st century, the concern about security tended to shift towards military security. I mean, that is a time when you have the genocide in Rwanda, you have the Somali conflict, you have the Liberia conflict, you have the Sierra Leone conflict, and all of those conflicts, which have been bloody, and they really, in terms of crimes against humanity, these crimes have been committed, including the Sudan. And therefore, we see that there is a gradual shift from the purpose for which the African Union and the African security architecture is created, that is to maintain peace and security for the purpose of regional integration and development. That is the purpose. That purpose now is not as strong. I give you one example. Out of over about 400 million euros paid by the European Union in the first installment between 2003 and 2008 to this African-Europe partnership, all of these resources that have been paid just in the Somali case, far less than 40 or 50% of this money has gone to soft security purposes. It all went to the combat forces and all of that. And also we see increasingly, of course, with the emergence of AFRICOM in the continent, that there is a model that in one way of winning hearts and minds is also try to use the security for development purposes. Of course, the issue of securitization of development and the linkages between development and security. And that created some very major issues. So my idea is that what Africa needs, in fact, is not military security, not the old notion of security, but rather human security. Because if you look at the problems very, very carefully, these are problems created by maldistribution of resources, poverty, greed by the elite, grievances by those who feel that they are left out, and unequal distribution of resources in the continent. But also you see that violence itself is not just a result of the fact that there is no military force to come to grips with violence. Rather, it is the other way around. In fact, the more you militarize development, the more society is militarized, the more you are going to have problems. So, in fact, African vision of security should be more targeted towards human security, that have respect for human dignity, as you have correctly said, and also human needs, basic human needs. And therefore, you see, despite the fact that the Cold War is ended, in the African continent in general, military expenditure has increased and increased tremendously. And sometimes in countries that are very poor, there's an increase in military expenditure at the expense, of course, expenditure on education and health and this and this and that. And that is why I think the shift of thinking has to be very serious, from military to human security.
I think these are absolutely relevant and important topics indeed. And on our course webpage, we also have some of your own readings on this subject matter. I think at this point we conclude this interview. Professor Salih,
Okay.
thank you very much for this interview.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me.
On the course page, indeed, please have a look at the additional readings that we have listed by Professor Salih himself and additional literature that you may be interested in. Thank you very much.